Some beasts died with honor, others with inconvenient timing. This is the story of a very large, very dead mammoth and a tribe who wished it had died anywhere else. Stay close to the fire. You're about to hear how grief rot and social obligation really stank in the Paleolithic. The mammoth died on a Tuesday. Not that they had calendars, of course, but if they had, it would have been the kind of Tuesday that flattens your hope and freezes your knees, the kind where snow crusted over the bones of the valley, and even the wind seemed to mutter something about turning back. The mammoth, to its credit, chose an impressively symbolic place to fall directly outside the southern entrance of the winter shelter, just close enough to block it, just far enough not to be useful. It had wandered there sometime in the night, wounded, probably, or simply tired of being large, and had laid itself down with a sigh no one heard. The morning sun found it first glinting gold along one half-raised tusk like a mockery of ceremony. It steamed faintly. Its eyes had frozen open. Its breath had not, and there it stayed. The first to see it was Puck, who had gone out to relieve himself in what he believed was a private moment behind a rock that was not, in fact, very private. Upon returning his face somewhere between reverent and furious, he said only, "We have a problem with the doorway." They gathered, they circled, they looked, they said things like, "Was it chased here? Is this a gift? Can we eat it? Will it draw cave lions? Did you leave the entrance unmarked again?" Survival ever practical, ever poetic. The beast's death, they soon realized, was neither sacrifice nor accident. It had simply happened. And now, as the sun rose higher, they all stood squinting at it, wrapped in fur and doubt. Someone coughed. Someone else attempted to spit solemnly, but missed and hit their own foot. No one wanted to be the first to step closer. It was the child, of course. It's always the child. A small shape named Inu crept forward, dragging a stick with great purpose. She circled the mammoth, poked at its trunk, and declared, "It's big," which, by tribal standards, was practically an official pronouncement. The elders nodded, each pretending they hadn't thought the same. One scratched his beard as though considering theology. Another muttered something about dream signs. And so, just like that, the fate of the day and many days to come was sealed. The mammoth had died. The tribe had witnessed. That meant something. Did it, though? Well, folk logic held that if a beast chose to die in front of your home, it either loved you or cursed you. Neither option was particularly relaxing. And so, the tribe did what tribes have always done when faced with spiritual ambiguity and logistical inconvenience. They argued politely. Someone suggested the mammoth must have known them. Perhaps it had been hunted before chased and spared. Maybe it returned old and ready to die to the only hunters it respected. That idea was warmly received until Brel, the sleepiest of the elders, reminded them they hadn't hunted anything in 3 moons. Not on purpose, anyway. Others wondered if it was an omen of plenty, or of doom, or of a long winter which was not so much prophecy as meteorology by pessimism. "It's too close to ignore," grumbled Deck, who always sounded personally offended by reality. "And too big to move," added Yanu, who had once tried to drag an elk uphill and still hadn't forgiven gravity. In the end, the consensus was simple and entirely unhelpful. The mammoth had chosen them, which meant they had to do something about it. That naturally was when the rot began. Not immediately, of course. On that first day, the beast looked noble, frozen quiet, its fur ruffled like some tragic painting. But time, like smoke in the eyes, was not kind. By the 3rd day, the smell began soft, sour, and strangely directional. You could sit by the fire and pretend it didn't exist so long as the wind was kind. The wind, like the tribe, grew increasingly unkind. Oh, they tried to ignore it. Fires were moved, beds were shifted. They developed a complex ritual of who had to face which direction while eating. Nobody wanted to sit downwind. One clever child began charging extra roots to trade spots near the better end of the fire. Capitalism, they would have called it, if they'd invented capitalism. Or roots. But of course the fire didn't judge. The tribe did, and soon judgments fell thick and petty. You left the door uncovered. You should have dreamed harder about elk. I told you the mammoth line was bad luck. They said it all in mutters, in looks, in long silences wrapped in smoke. And the mammoth stayed still, growing less mammoth-like by the hour. There was talk of moving it. But no one actually wanted to touch it. Someone had once known someone who touched a mammoth corpse and dreamed only of teeth for a year. So they hemmed, they hawed, they rotated watch shifts as though the carcass might escape. You, of course, would have called for animal control or a very large tarp. But you also would have died trying to microwave soup in a thunderstorm, so let's not cast stones. And so they waited. They honored it by ignoring it. They circled fire after fire, stories turning thinner, shorter, more desperate. Every third conversation somehow led back to the beast, though no one named it. No one dared name it, because naming made things personal. And they were not yet ready to be personally involved with a decomposing legend blocking their only good exit. Still, the child watched. Inushi of the stick and honesty kept drawing circles in the snow. She was the one who said it first, though. That comes later. For now, she just watched. And the wind blew in slow, sour ribbons. In the dusk, someone no one knew who placed a bark mask at the base of the mammoth's side. A tribute, perhaps. Or a dare. The mask was crude, smoke-blackened, carved in haste, but it stayed fluttering slightly in the cold wind. And with that, something shifted. The mammoth no longer lay alone. It had a watcher, a token, a face. Some began to whisper it was becoming sacred. Others muttered they'd better burn it before the lions got curious. Both agreed that it smelled worse today than yesterday. But they did not move it. They simply sat a little farther from the fire and listened to the rot, because sometimes silence is more contagious than sickness. And as the wind carried the scent across the circle, someone coughed and someone else looked skyward, pretending they weren't hoping for a snowstorm to cover it all. But snow wouldn't come, not yet, only stories. And one of them, one small, sharp, unspoken story, was starting to wrinkle its nose. The mammoth had not asked to belong to anyone, but in the way of all things inconvenient and large, its presence soon became a question of ownership. Not of gratitude, mind, no one was grateful, just possessive. Because if something was too big to move and too foul to ignore, it had to be someone's fault. And in Paleolithic logic, fault was just another form of inheritance. It began with the dreamers. Elder Vesh claimed he'd seen a mammoth in sleep 2 nights before its arrival, covered in lichen tusks, curved like the moon eyes, like damp stone. He had interpreted the dream at the time as a call to check on his sore tooth. Now, of course, it was clearly a visitation, a sacred warning, a sign that the beast was his burden. "I was chosen," he said solemnly, while chewing loudly enough to undermine the mystique. Brel disagreed because Brel disagreed with Vesh as a rule. "I saw it first," he announced, lifting his chin as if staking a plot of land. "First eyes own the omen." "You were urinating," someone muttered. "All vision is sacred," Brel replied, as if that solved anything. Then came the whisperers, those who had noticed certain tracks near the beast's final path. Name it a hunter with an almost impressively selective memory claimed she recognized the print of her own throwstone along the mammoth's flank. "It limped," she said. "It bled from the left. I hunted it once before. It followed me here." This was technically plausible, emotionally vivid, and socially disastrous, because now others remembered hunting it too. Soon every adult within memory's reach claimed some spiritual, symbolic, or tactical link to the deceased colossus. Some swore they'd dreamt of heavy footsteps. Others insisted the shape of its tusk matched one etched on the old wall. One woman who rarely spoke declared she'd once heard it sneeze, and hadn't that been an omen? You see, in a world before deeds, lawsuits, or fences ownership was determined by narrative, and nothing sharpened a Paleolithic memory like the chance to avoid communal duty. Which, of course, was the real issue. Whoever owned the mammoth had to do something about it. And so the debates became layered. First who saw it, then who dreamed it, then who touched it, then who should have touched it. Followed by the more abstract discussions of lineage. My mother once fed a dying mammoth moss and tribal prestige. Only my line has the patience to deal with this mess. They formed concentric circles of polite accusation. At the center, the steaming corpse stinking more with each sun. Around it, the elders' arms crossed, inventing wisdom. Beyond them, the hunters sniffing for escape routes. And beyond, all the quiet watchers, the children, the gatherers, the ones who knew better than to speak. Well, most of them. Inu, of course, did not abide by that wisdom. She was small, blunt, and fascinated by conflict. She took to drawing little mammoths in the dirt beside the fire, labeling them with names she overheard. This one is Vesh's. This one is Brel's. This one is Stinkbeast. Stinkbeast became a popular term almost immediately, which infuriated Vesh and Brel equally, perhaps the only unifying moment they shared in 2 seasons. Meanwhile, the smell deepened. The wind carried it through camp in long, sour sighs, like old guilt, like half-digested memory. It was no longer something one noticed. It was something one lived around. Folk logic held that rot could cling to the soul if you stood too near for too long, so no one lingered near the mammoth. They argued about it from a respectful distance, like people afraid of both death and responsibility, which, to be fair, they were. Still, the debates escalated. One morning, Vesh appeared wearing a scrap of fur he claimed had belonged to his ancestor, a sign of his right to the beast. Brel countered by rubbing ash under his eyes, declaring it mourning for the fallen. Namit simply dragged a chunk of mammoth dung into the center of camp and declared, "If I didn't own it, why does it know my scent?" That argument was regrettably quite effective. Someone tried invoking the spirits not out of belief, but desperation. Let the dead decide, they cried, which again was lovely in theory. But the dead had yet to develop a reliable voting system, or scented letters. So the tribe continued their slow circular descent into territorial performance art. The tusk pointed nowhere, and that was the point, muttered Yanu, staring at the massive curve now partly buried in slush. It seemed accusatory in its aimlessness, a gesture without meaning, like a finger pointed not at you but just near you, the kind that made you nervous. Still, someone had to do something. Winter thickened, the ground grew harder. The smell grew worse, and a subtle, unspoken consensus began to emerge. The more someone claimed ownership, the more likely they were to be assigned burial duty. And so the claims quite suddenly stopped. Vesh returned his sacred fur to storage. Brel washed the ash from his face. Namit stopped feeding the dung. No one admitted defeat, of course. They simply shifted tactics from proud ownership to noble abstention. "I don't claim it," Brel said loftily, because grief cannot be possessed. "I let it die in peace." Vesh agreed. That was the true ritual. "The mammoth came here for its own reasons," said Namit, who now avoided eye contact with the corpse entirely. And like that, ownership vanished. Not resolved, just diluted like blood in cold water. They went back to staring at it from a distance. The mammoth stayed. The bark mask flapped slightly in the wind. No one touched it. No one added another. The fire flickered low that night. No stories were told, only small noises, soft furs, and the long patient smell of things left unresolved. Because sometimes in old tribes decisions were not made. They were endured. And the mammoth, heavy, bloating, unavoidable, would wait for them to decide again. Until then it lay among them like guilt carved in muscle. The tusk gleamed faintly beneath starlight, and the child whispered to herself, she was the one who said it stank. The story was growing. The mammoth didn't move, so the people did. Not away, of course, migration would have been reasonable, and no one in this tribe had ever been accused of that. No, they began the slow and delicate art of circling, shifting and spiritually reinterpreting their living space in a way that made it increasingly unclear whether the mammoth was an obstacle and icon or simply the world's worst roommate. The first to adapt was Old Wen, who insisted the beast should not be mentioned aloud after sundown. It disturbs the boundary between warmth and memory, she declared, despite having previously declared that everything from fox dung to loud chewing disturbed memory. Still, the idea caught on mostly because no one wanted to argue with Wen once she'd tied feathers to her ankles, a sign she was walking in silence. That meant don't question her, or she'd start singing. And so the new taboo was born: do not name the mammoth after dark. Instead, they referred to it obliquely, the presence, the shadow near the south rock, that which fell inconveniently. This inspired a strange form of respect. If something must not be named, it must be important, possibly sacred, certainly annoying. Soon rituals emerged not out of belief, but bureaucracy. The fire was shifted 2 steps north to avoid smoke backdraft from the honored one. Anyone entering from the south was required to stomp 3 times and mutter a short phrase which began as, "Please don't smell," and slowly evolved into spirit of stillness, "Be still." Seating near the smell required a rotational chart hastily marked in charcoal by Inu, who took great joy in assigning rot shifts to adults she disliked. By week's end, the area around the carcass was informally designated as the Sacred South. It was avoided, occasionally bowed to, and once circled by a very confused dog that immediately regretted its curiosity. No one had declared it holy. It simply became the place no one wanted to stand, and in Paleolithic terms, that's practically a shrine. Of course, the smell continued. The wind was not bound by taboos. It carried its burden across the fire circle, like a rude relative at a gathering, persistent, personal, and oddly intimate. And because humans have a tragic gift for normalizing anything that lingers long enough, they began to treat it like weather. Some days you could eat without gagging. Other days you just nodded and said south wind again, as if that explained why your stew tasted faintly of regret. In the midst of this olfactory diplomacy, the rituals grew. Someone began smearing ash near their nose to block the scent. A practical solution that quickly gained mystical overtones. It shields the soul from decay, Brel explained, conveniently forgetting he'd first done it, after stepping too close to the carcass and vomiting impressively onto his own feet. Still, symbolism is more durable than truth, so the ash mask practice became common. And if you're imagining elegant spirals or ceremonial stripes, please don't. Picture adults desperately finger-painting their faces while gagging behind the cooking stones. Dignity was not part of the tradition, and yet somehow it worked. Not the masks, the pretending. They invented ceremonies to dodge confrontation, invented gestures to avoid effort, invented sacredness where there had only been rot. And it helped, not because it solved anything, but because it made inaction feel like culture. The fire didn't judge, the tribe did. And the tribe had chosen to judge in hushed tones and elaborate seating maps. It was Inu who first noticed that no one talked about food anymore. They still ate, of course, roasted roots, dried fish, the occasional squirrel that nobody admitted to cooking. But around the fire, once the only source of shared story, silence grew. People sniffed, people fidgeted, people adjusted their furs with a frequency bordering on obsession. Conversations faltered, and when they did speak, they spoke of weather dreams and the vague idea of change. Never the mammoth, never the problem, just atmospheres. Even the dreamers were quieter now. Vesh still muttered in his sleep, though whether it was spiritual visitation or indigestion remained unclear. Namet sharpened tools endlessly. Wen began collecting rocks that felt ignored. Brel developed a mild cough that no one believed was real, but everyone used as an excuse to shift seats when he got too close. The child, meanwhile, continued her commentary in charcoal and dirt. She drew stick figures vomiting. She scratched crude tusks into the bark of the shelter posts. She tied a stone to a scrap of fur and called it Spirit of the Stink, then insisted everyone greet it each morning or risk the curse of cold toes. Strangely, that one stuck, because in a world where illness was poorly understood and ritual was the closest thing to science, a cursed stink spirit felt more actionable than communal rot avoidance. One morning someone found a cracked mask pinned to the mammoth's side, not placed, not leaned, but stuck, frozen into the flesh. No one claimed to have put it there. No one wanted to be accused of spiritual violation, so they blamed the wind. You could almost hear the beast chuckle. The tusk pointed nowhere, and that was the point. It had long since shifted under its own weight. One side sunk into thaw and refreeze. Its direction changed by the day, which made it oddly democratic. No one could claim its aim. Everyone felt judged equally. Eventually someone asked, "Should we burn it?" They said it softly, like a child asking if the moon could be folded and put away. The question floated, hovered, vanished, because no one wanted to ignite something that sacred, inconvenient, or large. They would, eventually, but not today. Today they had other distractions, a fire to tend, a wind to curse, a mask to paint, a spirit of stink to appease with 3 pine cones and a polite grunt. They would circle the problem with custom, layer it in significance, pad it with meaning like dry moss on a cold stone. If they wrapped it in enough ceremony, maybe they wouldn't smell it anymore. But rot like memory seeps. And the fire, though it didn't judge, crackled differently that night. Less warm, more watchful, like it knew what the tribe had chosen to ignore. The bark mask flapped once. The south wind blew again. And somewhere near the sleeping firs, Inu whispered, she was the one who said it stank. Not yet, but soon. There are things you're not supposed to set on fire. A mammoth, it turns out, is one of them. It started with Deck's stubborn, smoke-faced Deck, who had endured 3 days of rot shifts in a row and finally decided that fire solved most things. He didn't announce his plan. He simply woke before the sun gathered wood like it owed him something and began building what can only be described as a funeral pyre with poor structural integrity and far too much ambition. Now Deck was not what you'd call spiritually inclined. His relationship with the sacred was transactional at best and profoundly flammable at worst. He once burned an entire thicket to avoid fetching water through it. His solution to unpleasantness was more often than not combustion. So when the mammoth's rear began to sag into the thawing soil, and a pool of something unspeakable seeped downhill towards his sleeping pit, he declared to no one in particular, "It dies again today." And the tribe awoke to smoke, not the comforting smoke of breakfast fires. No, this smoke was thick, oily, defiant, the kind that clings to hair and regrets. It billowed through the camp like a statement, and not a polite one. Someone screamed when, wrapped in furs and mourning grumbles, emerged from her shelter to find Deck feeding pine branches and dried dung into a smoldering blaze that licked up the mammoth's flank with the enthusiasm of a badly trained dog. "You'll wake the spirits," she shrieked, though given the smell the spirits had already packed up and left days ago. "The spirits should help if they're awake," Dick replied, eyes watering from both smoke and resolve. "I'm doing the work they won't." The bark mask ignited first a moment of terrible symbolism and even worse omen. It crackled, curled, and vanished in a gust. The onlookers gasped. Some clutched charms. One whispered, "The face is gone." That was when the real panic began. Vesh stumbled forward, coughing theatrically, and waving a stick of dried herbs in what was either a purification rite or a desperate attempt to cover the stench. Brel tried to douse the flames with a bowl of melting snow, only to slip and nearly land nose first into the fire. Namit threw a handful of ash at Dek and shouted, "That's not yours to burn." Ownership again, like rot it always returned. The flames didn't care. They spread across the dried grasses around the corpse's base, flickered up. The fur sputtered against wet patches, then burst into a plume as something possibly an internal organ, possibly a curse burst open. The sound was indecent, the smell worse. The tribe recoiled as one. A few tried to chant something, others tried not to vomit. One clever gatherer, Maru, began slapping wet pelts against the fire's edge in a last-ditch effort at damage control. It worked barely. The fire collapsed into a smoky, sizzling heap. The mammoth, now blackened and grotesquely steaming, oozed something that should never be described again. Everyone stared. No one spoke. Then, Dek, still holding his makeshift torch, looked around and muttered, "At least now it's half-cooked." No one laughed, not even Inu, who normally would have drawn it. That night, silence returned, brittle, offended, full of judgment. The fire circle was unusually sparse. No one sat near the southern edge, not because of superstition anymore, just because. The bark mask, now ash, was not replaced. No one offered to build another. It had been sacred once in the way things are, when they distract from a harder truth. But now there was only char and a new awareness you couldn't burn away a problem just because it smelled like one. Still, the rituals didn't stop, they just changed. Where once there had been polite avoidance, now there was careful watching. People began taking turns sitting near the corpse again, not out of duty but as a kind of punishment. You broke a taboo, you take rot shift, you mocked Vesh's dream again, enjoy the honored seat. And just like that, the South became a place of exile. The fire didn't judge, the tribe did. Folk logic held that fire revealed the truth of things. If it burned clean, the spirit was at peace. If it sputtered, something had been left unsaid. If it exploded in a gout of half-rendered fat and burning regret, well, clearly someone had done something wrong. By that logic, the tribe was now deeply spiritually unclean. So they cleaned. Not the mammoth, of course. That would have been practical. No, they cleaned symbols. Feathers were retied. Bones were rearranged in the charm circle. Someone re-blessed the sleeping mats by yelling at them. The drinking bowls were scrubbed with dry grass and ash, a practice invented on the spot by Namit, who declared, "If the spirits left through the mouth, we should clean the edges." They nodded solemnly. No one questioned her. Meanwhile, the mammoth continued to rot, now part charred, part melted, and somehow more present than ever before. The wind seemed to enjoy the transformation. It carried the scent with glee, threading it through the camp in little reminders of Dek's ambition. And in the shadows of the firelight, Inu finally said it. She had waited until the adults were pretending not to stare at the corpse. Waited until the fire had sputtered just low enough to make their faces look more tired than wise. Then she picked up a stick, pointed toward the southern edge, and declared, "It still stinks." Silence. Then Vesh said quietly, "She was the one who said it stank." The phrase landed like an old truth, sharp, familiar, strangely comforting. Someone chuckled. Someone else nodded. And for the first time in many nights, the fire didn't feel defensive. It felt shared. The tusk blackened at its tip, caught the flicker of flame again. It pointed nowhere, and that was still the point. There are few things more dangerous than a child with a clear opinion. Inu's pronouncement, "It still stinks," had cracked something open. Not just silence, not just the layers of ritual and rot they'd been carefully pressing over the problem, like hides over a drafty entrance. It cracked the agreement that no one was supposed to say what everyone smelled. You could almost hear the unspoken contract tearing in the firelight. For a brief moment there was no response, just wind curling through the fur-framed shelters and the quiet ancient sound of rot working its way into winter. But then Vesh, with all the ceremonial weight of an elder who'd recently burned his own eyebrows off during a blessing, muttered those immortal words. She was the one who said it stank. At first, it sounded like scorn, a dry slap of shame meant to shame a child back into silence. But then, someone repeated it this time with a hint of amusement. Then again, and now it had rhythm. It became a phrase, a refrain, a chant that tasted of guilt relief and the delicious pleasure of someone else saying the thing you didn't dare. She was the one who said it stank. They said it into their palms, into their bowls, into the thick night air like a smoke-borne confession. Because now that it had been said, they couldn't unsay it, and more importantly, they didn't want to. Poor Inu blinked through the sudden fame, unsure whether she was being punished or praised. She responded by immediately drawing a picture in the suet, a mammoth with spirals over its eyes and wavy lines around its rear. She labeled it stank in crude scratches. Dak, ever literal, added a stick figure vomiting nearby. That too caught on. Soon the south-facing shelter wall bore a full mural of the event mammoth rot lines, small human stick shape and a spiraled scent cloud shaped like a skull. The tribe for the first time in days laughed. Not loudly, not joyfully, but with the low, surprised snort of people who'd forgotten they still had mouths for more than muttering. And that laughter clarity and too much smoke was when someone declared they needed a ritual of cleansing. Not spiritual cleansing, blame cleansing. Because once you admit something stinks, someone has to be responsible for the smell. So they made a stick, not a majestic scepter or carved wand, just a stick about the length of a forearm, mostly straight charred, slightly at one end. It was chosen for having a face of truth, which in this case meant it resembled a finger pointing in judgment, which was conveniently its only real job. They called it the stick of power, though everyone knew that was code for the stick no one wants to hold. The rules hastily invented and then solemnly intoned by Wen were these: whoever held the stick was the designated bearer of the mammoth's shame. Not the blame itself, that would have been too final, but the current responsibility. The odor, the burden, the rot duty scapegoat of the day. It was to be passed each morning at dawn by unanimous agreement, or by subtle fire circle sabotage. Folk logic held that the stick finds the nose most deserving, which was a poetic way of saying watch your seat and don't fall asleep too early. The first holder was predictably Dak, not just because of the fire, but because he muttered finally when he picked it up as if martyrdom was something you could claim like a fallen pelt. He bore it with the exaggerated dignity of a man trying to be remembered in a story. He walked slowly past the carcass, waved the stick once, and whispered something dramatic. Probably a curse, though some said it was a poem. Either way, it didn't help the smell. By mid-morning, the stick had been ceremonially planted in a mound of snow near the southern edge. It lasted there until Maru, tripping while trying to avoid it, broke the tip clean off, which according to Wen shifted its power. Now the stick was even worse. Namet refused to hold it on account of her dreams. Vesh claimed spiritual allergy. Brel took it briefly, gave a speech, and then ceremonially offered it to a rock. That night it sat in the middle of the fire circle like an unwanted guest. No one moved it, no one even looked directly at it. But conversation shifted again, sharper, shorter, less coated in incense and excuses. And Inu was quietly proud. Not of starting a scandal that was accidental. No, she was proud because people were finally saying what she had smelled all along. The rot was real. The rituals were thin. And the stick of power, for all its theater, meant something now. It meant they'd stopped pretending the mammoth didn't matter. The smell still curled through the camp's subtle sour, slowly woven into every pelt and tool. You could wash your hands, but not your memories. And you could avoid the corpse, but not the way it had made you rearrange everything just to keep pretending it hadn't. The fire that night crackled soft and low. The tribe gathered closer than usual. Not out of warmth, but out of a strange unity. The kind that only grows from shared discomfort and mutual blame. Wen declared the South now held a mood. Vesh carved a new bark mask, this one simpler, more symbolic, less flammable. Someone replaced it beside the mammoth. No ceremony, no comment, just a nod. And the tusk dulled with soot, and sleep caught the light for a breath of time, like a fang from the past, refusing to decay politely. The fire didn't judge, but now the stick did. It began with a mud dream. Maru had it, or claimed she had it after 3 nights of sleeping too close to the south edge and waking up with her hair smelling like boiled shame. In the dream, the mammoth rose from the ground, dripping sludge and singing. Not a haunting melody, mind you, but something nasal and repetitive like Dake when he had a cold. It sang, then slipped into the earth like stew poured into a crack. When she woke, her hands were already dirty. Naturally, she took this as a sign. "We are meant to bury it," she said. To which Numet replied, "Are you volunteering to dig, Guy?" But it was too late. The idea had landed. Burial. At last, something physical. Something that didn't involve masks, chants, or assigning blame via burnt sticks. It sounded final. Or at least farther away than the current solution. The elders gathered to discuss. As usual, Vesh began with a dream monologue. Brel corrected him halfway through, and one tied feathers to something possibly herself, and muttered, "Everything sinks eventually." Folk logic agreed. Things left out either rotted, vanished, or became dangerous. And this mammoth had already done the first 2. Time to test the third. So, the burial was declared. Not as an apology, not as a cleansing, but as a gesture of mutual separation, which is just tribal speech for get it out of our way before the children start naming fleas after it. They picked the flattest patch of ground east of the camp, partly because it was close, mostly because it was slightly downhill. That they reasoned would help with the dragging. Spoiler, it did not. Dragging a dead mammoth is less of a task and more of a communal insult to physics. The beast had been rotting for over 2 weeks, and what hadn't bloated had sunk. It no longer resembled an animal. It resembled a collapsed tent filled with soup and memories. Still they tried. Namet led the charge with ropes braided from hide bark and desperation. Dick pushed from behind with the motivational clarity of someone determined to be remembered for something other than the fire incident. A few younger members were bribed into pulling duty with promises of extra root mash, which was wildly optimistic considering none had been dug in 2 days. Progress was made, then immediately unmade. The carcass shifted, and something inside it made a noise no one would describe. 2 members vomited, 1 fainted, the rest kept pulling. Folk logic again, if it moans, it's moving, which sounds brave until you hear the moan. And then came the sinking. The burial ground chosen for its softness became its betrayal. With each pull, the mammoth settled deeper into the mud. Not quickly, not evenly. It tilted, it twisted, it resisted in the way only truly stubborn things do. Not with force, but with passive collapse. Brel lost a boot. Wynn lost a feathered charm that no one helped retrieve. Deck, while shoving from the rear, slipped into the forming mire with a yelp and vanished up to the ribs. Only his cursing remained visible. And then Elder Tum slipped. Now Elder Tum was not the most graceful member of the tribe. He was shaped like a boulder in furs and about as easy to lift. He had also insisted on attending this burial to ensure spiritual balance, though most suspected he just wanted to complain firsthand. Tum took 1 step onto the edge of the pit, declared a sense, and immediately sank halfway down with a noise that turned the mammoth's groan into a harmony. He was pulled out eventually, mud-coated dignityless, with 1 eyebrow missing, and his ceremonial necklace caught in something best left unidentified. He said nothing for the rest of the day. That silence was the real omen. By dusk, they'd succeeded in burying perhaps 1/3 of the mammoth. Technically, they'd buried themselves more thoroughly. So they stopped. Someone covered the exposed hump with pine branches. Another tried to push the tusk deeper, only to discover it was now locked in place, a crooked marker, halfway buried, pointing nowhere. The tusk pointed nowhere, and that was the point. They circled it in silence. No chants, no feathers, no declarations of peace, just wet fur, sour breath, and the muffled squelch of boots trying to leave quietly. Back at camp, Inu asked who would hold the stick of power next. No one answered. She shrugged and propped it beside the fire, letting it lean at just the angle to feel judgmental. Later that night, Vesh declared the ground had accepted the offering. Wen replied, the ground tried to eat Tum. Dek said same thing, really. For the first time, nobody argued. The fire didn't judge, but it flickered differently higher, brighter, like it knew the rot had shifted beneath the earth and was now someone else's problem. That night, Inu drew the burial. In her drawing, the mammoth was a mountain, the people were ants, and the stick hovered like a spear above them all. She didn't explain it. No one asked. But she did say very softly before curling into sleep, "It's quieter now." It was, for a while, until the dreams began. Dreams are a funny thing, especially in the Paleolithic when sleep wasn't just rest, it was risk. And if your dreams began to echo with smells you'd buried well, that was everyone's problem now. It started with a cough, not the normal campfire cleared-your-throat cough. This one was deeper, muddier, like something forgotten in the lungs was trying to remember itself. Namit had it first. She'd helped lead the burial and hadn't washed her hands after. No water, she said, waving her muddy palms like a badge of sacrifice. The next morning she woke, saying she'd dreamed of tusks, long ones, taller than trees bending into the stars. She said they dripped with ash. Brel, of course, accused her of poetic exaggeration. Then he started coughing. Soon it was all of them. Nothing dramatic. Just little huffs, grumbles, the sound of breathing that tried too hard. And every dream, every single one, seemed to carry a dampness, a heaviness. The kind of sleep that leaves your mouth tasting like yesterday's fire pit, and your bones arguing with gravity. They didn't say anything at first. Paleolithic dignity demanded a certain level of denial. But the signs were there. Vesh forgot one of his own dream stories midway through. When normally fond of pre-dawn proverbs slept past the sunrise, even Dek skipped his usual complaint lap around the fire. The fire, for its part, burned clean. A little too clean. It didn't crackle, it whispered, and the wind which used to carry rot in loud, bitter gusts now brought it in faint, sour notes, just enough to remind never to overwhelm. Some said the burial had calmed things. Others, especially those who'd held the stick of power, said it had only made the mammoth harder to see, which of course made it more powerful. Inu noticed first. She woke one night to find everyone else already awake, not talking, not moving, just sitting around the fire, blank-faced, eyes half-closed, as if they'd risen all at once, pulled by a scent no longer outside but inside the skull. She said, "Are we dreaming the same thing?" No one answered, but 3 people nodded without meaning to. Wen began burning sage in her bedroll. Namit refused to sleep lying down. Vesh started muttering phrases like, "The tusk is pointing through me," which even for Vesh felt unsettling. The stick of power became a sort of insomnia baton. Whoever held it that day slept the worst that night. Brel, after his 3rd shift, took to burying it at sundown and pretending it had wandered off by morning. It did not help. You see, dreams had always been the playground of stories, where the spirits whispered ancestors, coughed reminders, and odd fish-headed things reminded you not to eat raw mushrooms again. But now dreams were repetitive. The mammoth appeared in nearly every one, not as it had died, not bloated and awkward, but watching. Standing just beyond the firelight, head low, tusk gleaming, always in the same direction, always just out of reach. Sometimes it wept smoke, sometimes it simply stood there breathing. And more than once it spoke not in words, but in the sound of furs rubbing together, of fire collapsing inward, of teeth grinding between sleep and fear. Inu's dreams were the worst. She said the mammoth followed her in them, not fast, not loud, but steadily, like the memory of something you forgot to finish. When she told Vesh, he suggested a dream offering herbs a shard of bone, maybe a whisper sung backwards. She tried. She buried a small piece of the stick of power near the pit. The next morning it had risen clean, dry, perched across the tusk like a decision no one wanted to make. The tribe took that as a message. Unfortunately, no one agreed on what it meant. Vesh said it was a sign to make peace. Wen said it was a warning not to dig deeper. Dake, of course, said, it means we didn't bury it deep enough. No one wanted to test that theory. Instead, they added to the mound. Quietly. Each person brought something a charm, a broken tool, a shard of bark, a half-chewed root. Nothing big, nothing ceremonial. Just little things, personal things. As if layering their own clutter over the grave would somehow smother the attention of the beast below. Folk logic held that attention from the dead was like snow in spring, unexpected cold, and prone to ruin things you'd just started enjoying. And the dead were undeniably paying attention. That was the strangest part, not the dreams themselves, but how aware they felt, like being watched from inside your own head. Wen described it best. It's like, you're not dreaming the mammoth is dreaming you. They all nodded. Even Brel, though he muttered something about poor sleep and bad moss, and the smell. Still there, just softer now, like an old regret, like breath behind your shoulder when no one's there. Inu drew it again, a fire circle, tiny people sleeping in a spiral, and the mammoth in the sky, not flying, just hanging there, its tusks like branches, its body made of cloud. She didn't label this one. No one needed her to. The fire that night burned hotter, as if trying to push something back. But the dreams came anyway, and for once they were not chased away by mourning. It began with a hum, not a song, not yet. Just a low, throat-warm thing, the kind of sound that slips out when you're too tired to think, and too full of silence to stay still. A sound that wove itself between the crackle of the fire and the sour drift of half-forgotten rot. Wen was the one humming. No one was surprised. She'd been awake for 3 nights, feathers askew, eyes like storm holes. She didn't say she meant to hum. She didn't say anything. She just sat at the edge of the fire circle, rubbing a smooth stone against her palm and letting the sound rise like steam. At first, no one joined in. Then, someone, probably Dek, though he'd later deny it, picked up the rhythm by tapping a stick on his knee. Then, Namit began swaying, her furs creaking in time. Vesh, not to be outdone by mere rhythm, started breathing through his nose like a flute with unresolved issues. It wasn't music, not really. It was too tired, too breathless. But it was something alive. And in a camp starved of clean sleep, real comfort, and anything resembling joy, it passed for a miracle. The song, if it could be called that, grew by accident. Someone mumbled a phrase. Someone else repeated it. Inu whispered a line about stink and stars. Dek turned it into a chorus, mostly because it rhymed with farts. Yes, really. You see, in grief humor finds the cracks. And what the tribe had, though they wouldn't call it grief yet, was a slow leaking ache. An ache that had soaked their bones, their dreams, their shared silences. Something too big to speak, too dumb to explain, like falling in love with an argument, or missing something you never liked to begin with. The mammoth had taken up residence in their lives. In death, it had camped between them like a secret no one could stop tripping over. But that night, the night of the hum, they let it become something else. Not sacred, not solved, just sung. And oh, how strange it sounded. A dozen voices, all too tired to harmonize, all too close to sleep or laughter to care. Phrases layered like furs, one about the tusk, one about stink, one about how Vesh's toes smelled worse than the mammoth ever did, to which Vesh proudly added a verse. The fire flickered higher, encouraged by the noise. The stick of power still propped nearby like an overbearing ant caught the rhythm too. Someone tied a tuft of fur to the top and waved it like a baton. The tribe cheered. or groaned. Either way, it became part of the rite. And in that moment, something changed. Not big, not loud, just a breath between grief and release. Folk logic held that songs held memory longer than words, that a tune could carry a truth too heavy for a story. And this song, rough and rambling as it was held them, it held their sleep-starved regrets. It held the shame of botched burial and burned fur. It held the humor they weren't sure they were allowed to feel yet. And the mammoth buried, rotting, half-forgotten, became part of it. Not the subject, the rhythm. Its absence thudded between verses like a heartbeat. A reminder, a drum no one beat but everyone followed. Inu began to dance. Not a real dance, just small movements hand to toe, foot to knee, a bounce that matched the mumble. Her shadow rippled along the mound where they'd half buried the beast. The tusk caught firelight and blinked like something tired of being serious. And that was when they laughed. Not at Inu, not even at the lyrics, which by then had devolved into a chant about the day the wind went wrong. They laughed because the thing that had tied their tongues and stunk their dreams and warped their rituals had finally become bearable through noise, through nonsense, through the strange, accidental power of people making noise together in the dark. Wen's hum returned near the end, this time slower. She held the note as long as her breath allowed, then let it fall into the coals. Silence returned, but it didn't sting. The fire didn't judge. The tribe didn't either. Not that night. They sat long after the last note faded. Vesh sniffled, blaming the smoke. Namit leaned against Dek's shoulder like it hadn't been her shovel that got him buried last week. Brell, eyes half closed, muttered something that may have been gratitude or indigestion. And the dreams that came after were quieter. Not gentler, not quite, but quieter, less watching, more wandering. The mammoth still appeared, but not always looming. Sometimes it simply sat, or blinked, or walked slowly across a sky made of old fur. Inu in her dreams offered it a stick, not the stick of power, just a stick. Plain, shared. It didn't take it, but it nodded. She woke smiling, and for the first time in weeks, no one asked who had the rot shift. The stick of power remained untouched by the fire. No one needed to hold it, not because the blame had vanished, but because for a single night they'd remembered how to carry it together. The singing helped, but not for him. Ulan, once the best among them, with a spear, had not joined the humming. He'd sat just outside the fire's reach, sharpening a bone point that no longer needed sharpening. His back turned to the laughter, his breath slow and bitter. While others found comfort in absurdity, chanting about rot and feet and weather mammoths, Ulan stayed still. His silence wasn't sacred, it was surgical. The kind of silence that trims away what doesn't deserve to stay. And it grew louder after the song. You see, Ulan had been the one who should have killed the mammoth. That's what nobody said, which meant, of course, that everyone knew. It was Ulan who had tracked it 3 seasons ago, watched its limp, its strange, circling patterns. He'd seen it hesitate at the edge of the ridge. He'd lowered his arm, once let the spear drop. Why no one had asked? Perhaps it was mercy, perhaps exhaustion. Perhaps he had simply been tired of being the one to end things. Either way, the mammoth had walked away. And now it had walked back and died in their doorway like a question never answered. So Ulan stopped eating. He didn't announce it. He didn't dramatize. He simply passed the bowl when it came, let the roots grow cold in his lap, tossed smoked meat to the fire piece by piece, as if feeding something hungrier than himself. The tribe noticed, of course. Not all at once, but slowly. The way one notices a fire losing heat too late to fix it too soon to panic. Namit offered him marrow. Wen tried prayers. Brell muttered something about hunger as communion, which was a phrase he definitely invented just then and promptly forgot. Inu, bless her, brought him a pebble painted to look like a fat squirrel. He took it, smiled, didn't eat. The fire didn't judge, someone said, but maybe it should have. Ulan spent his days farther and farther from the fire, watching the mound, watching the tusk, watching the tribe pretend that something had ended when they'd buried it. He knew better. The mammoth wasn't done with them. It had just paused. In dreams, it no longer stood behind him. It stood beside him, breathing slowly, like an old companion, or, worse, a mirror. Ulan hated dreams, and hunger for all its cruelty didn't dream. By the 5th day, Dek tried force-feeding him. It ended with a thrown root and 2 cracked ribs, Dek's not Ulan's. He's strong enough to refuse food when observed, so maybe let him. Vesh attempted diplomacy by inviting Ulan to share a ceremonial chewing root. Ulan chewed once, spat it out, and said it tastes like pretending. So that ritual ended too. The stick of power made its way to his side, as if hoping for redemption. Ulan ignored it, left it propped against a rock where the wind eventually knocked it into the coals. No one retrieved it. Some claimed the mammoth had claimed him not in body, but in purpose, that he'd become the human version of the tusk pointing nowhere, but meaning something. Others whispered about spirits, curses, ancestral debts. One child declared Ulan must be transforming, into what she wasn't sure, but definitely something mammoth-shaped. Inu simply said he's thinking, which coming from her was the kindest reading possible. But truthfully, Ulan wasn't fasting for honor, or protest, or sacred connection. He was punishing the mammoth by refusing to let it feed him even in death. Because what is grief, if not the refusal to be comforted by what once brought you joy? And Ulan had once hunted for joy. He remembered the rush of the chase, the way breath came cold and clean, the moment before a spear flew, not anger, not fear, just aim, that perfect second where you could choose to end something. He hadn't chosen, not last time, and the mammoth had made its own end on its own terms in his camp. So now he sat. Let hunger strip him clean. Let memory gnaw on the ribs he'd left empty. Folk logic held that fasting clarified the mind, that the body, when denied, gave up its distractions. That starvation was a kind of sharpening, like flint scraped to spark. But Ulan was already sharp, and there was no fire waiting. He wasn't seeking truth. He was rejecting forgiveness. By the 8th day, even the dreams stopped visiting him. That was what made the tribe nervous. The rest still dreamed the mammoth, its eyes, its breath, the thudding silence of its tread. But Ulan slept without shadow, without scent, without song. And when a man stops dreaming, it's either because he's done with the world, or because the world is done with him. They didn't know which, so they gave him space. He didn't ask for it. He simply sat near the mound, hands in his lap, eyes on the tusk. Some nights he whispered, no one knew what. Some nights he didn't move at all, and the mound, half frozen, half forgotten, listened. That was the strange part. It really did feel like it listened, like Ulan was speaking to something that might yet answer. And if it did well, the fire would be ready. It didn't judge, but it remembered. You couldn't really plant a tusk. Everyone knew that. Tusk wasn't root. It didn't sprout. It didn't drink. It didn't grow. It pointed. That was its job. That was all it did. And still someone planted it. It wasn't a decision exactly, more of a moment, an action made of many small silences. Brel did it? Yes, that Brel, the mutterer, the traditionalist, the one who once refused to move a fire ring because the stones remembered where they'd been. But grief makes gardeners of us all, and Brel had been circling the mound for days, chewing less, speaking, less, watching Ulan with the wary respect of someone who feared either sainthood or madness, possibly both. One morning, while the tribe scraped frost from their mats and traded dreams like bitter nuts, Brel hauled the unburnt tusk out of the muck and wedged it tip down into the soft earth beside the mound. No words, no ceremony, just pressure, slow, repetitive, the sound of bone grinding against thawing mud. When it stood crooked and gleaming with frost, Brel stepped back and said, "There, let it point to something." Nobody asked what. That was part of the magic. You see, the tusk had always pointed nowhere. It had shifted and the wind slouched, after dragging and sunken during the burial. Every direction it had chosen before had ended in awkwardness or argument. But now, forced upright like a statement, it felt different. It felt planted, which of course made no sense. And that was the point. Inu called it the standing curve. Dake called it Brel's folly. Vesh, never one to let symbolism go unclaimed, muttered something about spiritual arbors and began carving circles around it in the dirt. Namit just shrugged. At least now it's not pointing at my tent. The wind predictably began to shift. It was warmer that day, just slightly, enough to make the rot soften under the mound to melt the frost into small runnels down the tusk's side. It glistened like a tree trying to remember how to bleed. And that's when the green came. Not much, not suddenly. Just a sprout absurdly small, defiantly early. A sprig of something that had no business surfacing this side of the freeze, right at the tusk's base, right where no one had planted anything. Maru spotted it first. She bent, sniffed, touched, recoiled. It smells like mammoth. Everyone gathered, stared, waited. Nothing else happened. But in a world where survival came down to signs and guts, and who you trusted to interpret the twitch of a branch, even that was enough. Some took it as a blessing, others a warning. Wen declared it a memory plant. Vesh declared it proof that tusks could guide spirits. Dake declared it absolutely cursed and refused to sleep facing east. The tribe, as was tradition, began inventing meanings as fast as they could disagree with them. But the sprout didn't care. It kept growing, not quickly, not tall, but surely. Steady, persistent. It was neither tree nor flower. Its stalk was too thick, its leaves too soft, its color wrong for anything useful. But it was alive, and it was near the mammoth. And that was enough. Inu began bringing it pebbles. She arranged them in a circle, small, symmetrical, protective. Each morning she'd rearrange them, whisper to the sprout, and report to whoever was listening what it had said. On the fourth morning it says the mammoth liked mud. On the sixth it dreams in smells. On the seventh, it doesn't forgive, but it remembers funny things. The adults humored her. But secretly they began to believe, because now the grave had something new, not rot, not regret, but growth. And that complicated everything. Folk logic held that the dead, if buried improperly, would poison the ground. But this was the opposite. This was something rising. Brel claimed credit, obviously. It's because I planted the tusk upright, he declared, adjusting his belt and stance simultaneously. Tells the earth we're done carrying it. Now it carries us. Vesh insisted the sprout was just the beast's breath, finding a new path. Wen argued that roots could carry memory if the soil was soft enough. And Ulan, he watched, said nothing, ate nothing. But he moved closer to the sprout each night. By the 10th day, the sprout had become a marker, a place where food was left. Words were whispered. Feet were traced in spirals around the tusk's base. Not worship exactly, more like a truce. The mammoth was still under them, but now it had company. Inu tied a scrap of fur around the tusk hers. From her first cold night, she said it was a gift. Brel muttered, "It's going to start requesting rent." No one laughed, not because it wasn't funny, but because they were all listening now. Not to each other, but to the presence that had once been a problem and now stood silently as if waiting for a proper ending. That night the wind carried a new smell. Still mammoth, still strange, but also green, damp, living. Wen breathed it in and said she was the one who said it stank. And they all knew what she meant. Because rot when buried well becomes something else. And sometimes the only way forward is to plant the past and see what has the audacity to bloom. The sprout was still alive when they tried to burn it again, not the sprout, the mammoth. The sprout, small and green and strangely respected, stayed where it was, curling stubbornly beside the tusk like a soft contradiction. But the beast below, the one under the mound, under the guilt, under weeks of ritual and misdirection, someone decided it was time to finish what Deck had failed to do, fire it. No one admitted whose idea it was, but one morning the fire was different, too hot, too built. The pile of kindling was too deliberate, the silence too rehearsed. And there by the mound's edge was the old bark mask, or a new one shaped the same, hung on a stick, smoking lightly as if testing the air for permission. This time there was no shouting. The tribe gathered without instructions, not because they were ready, but because not gathering felt worse. They brought small torches, dry twigs, careful glances. Even Ulan Thinner, now still unspeaking, stood near the sprout and stared. They called it a farewell kindling, called it closure, called it necessity. No one called it what it was, fear dressed in ceremony. Vesh muttered over the flames, something about ashes carrying memories skyward, about smoke being the breath of endings. Wen added, just don't stand downwind. Dick snorted, still bitter, still coughing. Folk logic said you had to burn things to let them leave. Spirits, shame, unwanted memories all preferred fire exits. So they lit it, softly, without drama. And for a moment, just one perfect still moment, it worked. The flames caught, the dry branches fed on the half-rotted offerings left at the mound's edge, licked up the bark pole and into the mask. It flared orange, then blue, hot enough to singe the nearby air into reverence. Even the wind held its breath. Then the wind remembered who it was, and it changed directions. Hard, sudden, like a slap made of sky. The smoke that had been rising in a gentle upward spiral now curled back into the camp, into their furs, into their mouths, into their memories. It wasn't just smoke now, it carried everything. The scent of failure, the stench of old rot, the burnt edges of things no one had finished grieving. And in the middle of it all, something sharper, something that didn't belong to the beast but to them. Regret. Regret stinks in a way even death can't match. It clings, it itches behind the eyes, it winds into your hair and won't wash out. Namet dropped her torch. Deck swore and covered his face. Inu started coughing so hard she hiccuped, then laughed, then cried, and nobody could tell which came first. The bark mask split in the fire with a noise like a scream being corrected. The sprout shivered. And the mound, that slow, quiet mound, let out a single puff of steam, as if exhaling. Vesh tried to speak over the wind voice, cracking into smoke. Wen simply turned her back and muttered, too late, always too late. The fire collapsed inward. Not out of wood, out of will, because whatever they'd meant to release had not left. Not up, not out, not away. It had risen, yes, but into them. And that more than anything silenced the circle. After the embers died, they sat not because they wanted to, but because standing meant making decisions, and none of them had decisions left. Except Ulan. He walked to the mound, slow as cold syrup, and knelt beside the sprout. His hand hovered, then pressed ever so gently into the earth beside it, not pulling, not planting, just touching. And he said his first words in days, still warm. No one asked what he meant. No one needed to. Because the mound was warm now, not fevered, not angry, held. That night most slept with their backs to the wind. A few wept into their furs, though no one claimed the tears. The stick of power singed at one end and warped by the fire was quietly buried beneath the stones. No ceremony, no successor. It had judged enough. The sprout stayed green. Ash blew into the corners of the camp, into the roots of their belongings, into the folds of their sleeping furs. Inu tried brushing it out of her braid and gave up. It's in the hair now, she told Namet. Namet, rubbing soot into her palms like salve, just nodded. Because grief never leaves clean. It clings, it smolders, it grows things. Seasons in the old way of counting didn't pass, they peeled. One layer at a time, Ice lifted off stones like old scabs, roots blinked awake, shadows walked taller, and stories like moss crept quietly across everything left untouched. The mammoth, long buried and half burnt, became less visible and more present. The mound softened, the sprout thickened, the tusk, weather-blanched and leaning, stood like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one dared rewrite. And the tribe, they remembered, but not, of course, the truth. The truth was messy. Truth smelled like failure and stubbornness and old singed fur. Truth involved fire, gone sideways, mud up the nose, and the sharp hiss of someone gagging behind a charm circle. No one wants to pass that down, so they passed down the story. It started as a caution, the beast that fell too close. Then a lesson, don't chase what isn't running. Then a parable, when the tusk points nowhere, stay still. Each version was shorter, cleaner, gentler. The smell was edited out. The child's honesty became a voice of clarity. The failed cremation became a flame, too sacred to burn. Even Deke was remembered kindly, which by his own standards was suspicious. Ulan, who eventually began eating again quietly, privately, like someone hiding forgiveness in a bowl, was never mentioned in early tellings. Later, he became a silent witness, then a mystic, then something between a hunter and a ghost. And Inu, her name remained, but it was no longer just Inu. She became the girl who spoke the truth, the one who said it stank. She was the one who said it stank. They'd mutter with the same tone one might say, she held fire in her mouth, or she stepped where the elk had dreamed. The phrase became a spell against denial, a charm for bad weather, a quiet joke told beside smoky cook fires. The child who had drawn mammoths with stink lines now sat beside the elders listening as those stink lines were transformed into metaphor. She didn't correct them, she just kept drawing. More mammoths now, always slightly too big for the hide she scratched them on. Sometimes they were smiling. Sometimes they had wings. Once, she drew one curled beneath a tree that looked suspiciously like a sprout. Folk logic held that stories kept you warm in the seasons when food couldn't. And so they told the mammoth story, over and over, sometimes with chants, sometimes with silence, sometimes while chewing roots too dry to swallow without laughter. The bark mask never returned. The stick of power buried under stones remained unnamed. Occasionally a child would trip over it and feel deeply judged. The fire, as always, did not judge, but it crackled a little louder whenever someone dared mention the wind that changed directions. By the third peeling of seasons, the mound was part of the landscape. The sprout had become a low, wide shrub, glossy, stubborn, oddly fragrant. No animal grazed it, no child picked from it. They called it the memory bush. No one remembered why. Except, of course, they did. They just chose not to say it aloud, because the mammoth was now a lesson, not an inconvenience. A mark in the communal memory that said, this happened, we survived. We laughed too late, but we did laugh. Inu, now older, once asked Vesh, is it lying if the story leaves parts out? He squinted at the fire, then said, it's not lying, it's tidying. Then added after a long cough, we only clean what we want to keep. When now mostly feathers and opinions called the story a smoke path, winding, always shifting, but still leading back to something warm. Dake, for his part, insisted that if he hadn't tried to burn the mammoth, they'd have never discovered the spiritual properties of second-hand ash. He began collecting soot in small pouches and selling it as a dream aid. It didn't work, but it gave people something to sniff before bed. And the children, they played near the mound without fear. They built circles of stone near the tusk and used them as pretend fire rings. Sometimes they spoke in deep guttural voices and declared themselves mammoth priests. Sometimes they lay on their backs, heads touching the tusk, and told made-up dreams to each other until sleep took over. One child, not Inu's but a niece perhaps, whispered that she dreamed of a giant beast made of shadows and warmth. One that walked slowly through the sky, sniffing for laughter. Everyone agreed it sounded like a good dream, so they named that beast the Stankwalker, They said it could only find you if you lied about what hurt. And so lying became less common. Folk logic now held that grief grew branches, that stories bloomed best when watered by embarrassment, and that if a mammoth dies in your camp, you make it sacred, or it makes you ridiculous. Either way, it sticks, like ash in the hair. By the time Inu was allowed to speak first at gatherings, she rarely needed to speak at all. The hush that fell when she stepped near the fire was never asked for. It arrived like weather, slow, inevitable, gentle in its gravity. Even the youngest learned to fall quiet. Even the wind occasionally paused. This was not because she was the oldest. Wind still held that title stubbornly alive, feathers faded, but fluffed with defiance. And it wasn't because Inu had led hunts, or blessed fires, or barked wisdom like Vesh once had, before he mistook a beetle dream for prophecy and tried to marry a tree. It was because of one thing, one truth that had ripened into legend. She was the one who said it stank. Not loudly, not cruelly, just first. She had named the thing everyone tiptoed around, and in doing so, she had become the tribe's unwritten rule that someone must always say the honest thing, especially when it's inconvenient, especially when it smells. And so over time, Inu became not just a speaker, but a listener of silences. She would crouch beside the fire knees, popped from age one hand, always smudged with charcoal, and wait until everyone had not said what they were thinking. Then she'd say it, simply, with that same child's clarity. "This is about shame," or "You're still angry about the root pit," or he misses her and doesn't know how to say it without coughing. Each time the tribe would inhale, sharp shared, relieved. Folk logic evolved accordingly. Let Inu name it before it becomes heavier. She never abused the power, never made performance of her place. And once a year, on the night the frost first kissed the sprout leaves near the mound, now a full round shrub with purple tips, and a name no one dared translate, she told the story. The whole story. Not the tidy one, not the child-proof version, but the story with rot and fire and mistakes that still made her wince when she said them aloud. She even brought the stick of power out of its stone tomb. Still singed, still warped, she'd wave it once like a joke, then lean it beside her and say, "I held this, not for blame, for balance." The children would giggle, the elders would pretend not to. She described the sound of the first fire, that hideous wet pop, when the corpse cracked. She recalled Ulan's hunger, the way his silence made more noise than shouting. She mimicked Brel's planting grunt, reenacted Dick's smoke dance disaster, and always described the wind's betrayal with such scorn it made even the coals shift. But most of all, she told the truth of not knowing what to do, because that she said was the truest part. Not the mammoth, not the mound, not even the singing. The moment when everyone stood still looking at each other, pretending they had a plan and realizing they didn't. The fire didn't judge, she'd say, voice gravel soft, but we did. And then she'd laugh, not a big laugh. Not the kind you boast with, a small grateful one, as if amused by how much they'd grown out of something they'd once wanted to bury. Then she'd go silent, letting the crackling speak for her. And every time without fail someone new would speak next. Not chosen, just moved. As if the story had made room for another. The mammoth story was no longer hers, it was theirs. And what a strange legacy it left. Children now touch the tusk before big days, not as blessing, not as dare, but as reminder. "Don't forget your smell," they'd whisper. It was a saying now, a shorthand for "don't lie to yourself." Hunters marked arrows with tiny spirals to honor the beast who died near a door. Cook fires were built slightly farther from the southern edge of camp just in case. And if someone tried too hard to purify a ritual, someone else would always mutter, "Careful. The rot's where the roots start." Even Vesh's dream chants, long since absorbed into communal mockery, were remembered fondly. His misinterpretations had unintentionally provided more cultural glue than 3 winters' worth of dried marrow. And as for the sprout, it was now taller than a child, dense, green-stemmed, blooms like bruised moons in spring. They didn't harvest from it, didn't weave its leaves, they just let it be. A thing that shouldn't have grown but did. The mound was no longer a grave. It was a place to remember what went wrong and what didn't stay wrong forever. When Inu passed near it now, she didn't bow. She nodded, like to an old rival, or a relative you see only once a year and somehow always feel complicated about. Because grief never vanishes, but it does become manageable, like a scent you can name, like something that stays in the hair but only catches you now and then when the wind shifts just right. They didn't call it sacred. That would have made it someone's responsibility. And after all the trouble, the stories, the stick-waving ceremonies, and dream-fueled sleep deprivation, the last thing anyone wanted was to make a shrine out of a mistake. But still, they visited. Not in processions, not in chant, just now and then passing, pausing, sitting, sometimes alone, sometimes 2 at a time, never more than 3. Folk logic said the mound didn't like crowds. It didn't do anything. It didn't glow or whisper or gift prophetic squirrel sightings. It just was a hump of softened earth never quite overgrown, ringed faintly with stones nobody admitted placing. The tusk still stood, of course, angled now, listing slightly like it was listening to the ground instead of the wind. Moss flecked its base. The shrub beside it had taken to blooming irregularly, with small petals that smelled vaguely like old wood smoke and onion. And then there was the breath. Not actual breath, don't be ridiculous. This isn't that kind of story. But people swore that if you sat long enough by the mound in a certain posture of not watching and not thinking, you would feel something shift. A stillness that noticed you back. A pause that pressed on your ribs just behind the last regret. Children called it the Mammoth moment. Elders said nothing, but they visited more than anyone. Inu, now truly aged, came once a season. She no longer walked the full path from camp. They carried her partway in a carved cradle chair that Deck's descendants built using one of his old burnt sled frames. She'd hobble the last few steps, settle near the mound, and say absolutely nothing for as long as she pleased. Then she'd mutter, "Still smells like shame," and chuckle, because time had not erased what had happened. It had soaked in, and like smoke in fur, it clung not unpleasant, not unwelcome, just there. She never updated the story anymore. That task had passed on. Others told it now with new embellishments, unnecessary mammoth accents, and a suspicious number of jokes at Brell's expense. Inu didn't correct them, because the point was never the facts. The point was that it mattered. It had happened. It had shaped them. It had broken and bonded and bewildered them. And the mound. Oh, the mound didn't need to be sacred. It was remembered. And in a world of smoke and rot and short lives and cold nights, that was stranger still. A remembered thing didn't need caretakers. It took care of them. One child, brave or foolish, or both, once tried to dig near the mound. Not into it. Just close. Looking for a beetle, they said. The tribe didn't stop them. They didn't need to. The wind did. It changed direction with sudden clarity, swept dust into the child's eyes, and snapped a branch clean from the shrub with a crack, like old bones being reminded. The child returned to camp with eyes streaming and heart thudding. They never dug again. Not out of fear. Out of understanding. Later they would say, "It didn't want me to find what wasn't mine," which was a good line and made it into the story thereafter. Folk logic agreed you don't search the past for what didn't invite you. You wait and listen, and if it wants to speak, it will. The mound became a place for whispering regrets. Wynne, near her final season, admitted aloud to the mound that she once faked a dream to win an argument with Vesh. He dreamed better, and it made me petty, she confessed. Then she asked for a good death and left a feather with a knot in the middle. 2 nights later, she passed. No drama, no groaning, just went quiet. They said the feather vanished. Others followed. Maru brought a cracked bowl and said, "This held a soup I never shared." Name-It laid a tiny bone carving and whispered, "I thought I was right. I wasn't." Even Deck, ever defiant, eventually limped to the mound and placed a chunk of fire-blackened wood. "This wasn't your fault," he told it. "It was mine. But don't get used to apologies." Then, in typical Deck fashion, he added, "But also you did stink." The mound did not reply. But the next morning the wind blew toward the west for the first time in weeks. Someone called it a sign. Someone else called it weather. The mound didn't care, because the mammoth, long dead, long buried, long burned, didn't need to care. It had already done its work. It had changed them, taught them, haunted and humbled and held them, even the ones who hadn't been born yet, especially those. Because inherited memory, like inherited scent, lingers longer than logic. And when a child someday asked Inu why they still visited a hill that no longer held bones, Inu only said, "Because something here still listens." And sometimes in that hush between stories and sleep, the child would think just for a moment that they heard a great breath below the earth. Not threatening, not grieving, just present, still warm. No one remembered the mammoth's name, mostly because it never had one. They'd named so many things, rocks, paths, injuries, moods, but not the beast itself. Not the one who died at their door, who bloated and burned and buried itself in the smell of their fire and the corners of their sleep. They'd named the shame. They'd named the stick. They'd even named the wind after it. But the mammoth, it had stayed unnamed. And that strangely made it more present. You see, a named thing becomes manageable, pronounceable, pointable. It fits into stories like a pebble fits into a hand, but an unnamed thing that lingers. It stretches around meaning, refuses to lie still, demands to be felt, not filed. And so the mammoth, long dead, long sung, still breathed at the edges of the firelight, not as a ghost, not as a spirit, but as a truth. The kind you learn slowly and carry always. Each season the story shifted again. One year it was about community, how they came together in their failure. Another year it was about listening to children to rot to winds that never blew twice the same. Later still it became a story about grief and how it chooses its own size. But the best tellings, they weren't about the mammoth at all. They were about a people who had no idea what they were doing and chose against every instinct not to run away. They sat, they smelled, they fought, they sang. They planted. And in doing so, they did the most ancestral thing of all. They made their confusion sacred. The mound remained, not exactly central, not quite forgotten. It became part of the map no one drew, but everyone knew. A direction measured not by compass, but by memory. To go there was to admit something had changed. To sit there was to allow the past to breathe without makeup. And the tusk? It leaned a little more each year. Children propped it up with stones, then branches, then just hope. By the time Inu passed gently in her sleep, muttering something about mushrooms and mammoths, the tusk had curled into a soft question mark. It no longer pointed. It asked. They did not burn her. She had very specifically requested not to be involved with fire ever again. Instead, they wrapped her in softened bark, tucked a piece of the old stick of power beside her, now shortened to a charm-size relic, and buried her just downhill from the mound. Not beneath it, never that, but near enough that, as one child put it, she can still smell what's true. They left no marker, only a drawing scratched into stone, a mammoth, a sprout. A figure with arms outstretched and a nose scrunched. She was the one who said it stank. That line, once mocking, had become a kind of prayer. Not solemn, not showy, just honest. And in the hush that followed her passing, the tribe didn't light a fire. They simply gathered around where the wind touched both her grave and the mound. And they listened. No dreams came that night. Only a soft quiet, not emptiness, stillness. Because the mammoth, that great, awkward, inconvenient interruption, had taught them the one thing the Paleolithic rarely gave anyone the chance to stay with discomfort long enough to learn from it. They did not worship the mound. They did not ask it for wisdom, but when someone forgot themselves, spoke without thinking, judged too fast, blamed too loudly, another would always say, "Go sit with the mammoth." And they would. And they'd come back quieter, less certain, more real. That was the legacy. Not awe, not power, but presence. The presence of what cannot be fixed, only witnessed. The presence of stories that don't end, just shift positions in your sleep. The presence of memory so tangled with shame and love that to untie it would be to lose the shape entirely. They did not speak the mammoth's name because it had become theirs. All of theirs, even yours. Yes, you sitting there still awake imagining a rot-slick story from a time before time. You've smelled things that linger. You've carried stories that itch behind the ribs. You've pointed nowhere and hoped it meant something. So maybe, just maybe, you've met the mammoth too. It lives not in the mound, but in the pause before you speak. The breath you hold when truth would be uncomfortable. The laughter that follows grief too closely. It's not sacred. It's just remembered, which in the end is stranger still. The fire didn't judge, but it remembers with warmth. And if you sit quietly enough, you might hear the ground breathe. Or maybe that's just you. And that's good. Let it be you. So now the fire has faded, and the mammoth, well, it's still there, but quieter. Not in bone, not in stink, not even in story. Just in that strange, enduring way grief has of making itself useful. A lesson, a root, a memory, no longer trying to escape. You've heard a tale tonight that started in rot and ended in reverence. Not because anyone planned it that way, but because that's how we survive, isn't it? We take the things that stink, we turn them into something we can name, and when naming fails, we sit beside them anyway, until they stop scaring us, until they bloom. Some memories ask to be retold, others just ask to be carried. The mammoth didn't want a funeral, nobody wanted to give it one, but it got one anyway. And that, in its own clumsy, smoky, bone-deep way, was enough. If you smell something in your sleep tonight, don't flinch. Don't light a torch. Just say, "I see you," even the inconvenient need to be witnessed. Good night.